And so what we have, what we're facing in this case, for instance, are impacts over landscape, life, even the communities that live there had to be moved, like in other parts of the country where big dams are built. There's a number of environmental impacts. Of course, there are the benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions that we can gain from building these dams, but this environment cannot be just looked at from an emissions perspective. There's other issues to take into account. There's also issues to do with pricing and with the social distribution of access or the capacity to pay for energy. Portugal is one of the countries in Europe with highest levels of energy poverty, as you can see in this map. There's a lot of people that do not have enough money to pay for their houses to be properly warmed in the winter, and increasingly to address the need to cool them in ever warmer summers as we are facing. And this has all sorts of consequences, including health ones. There's also issues to do with ownership and the distribution of gains. Who are the people, the companies gaining in the middle of all this? We know that we have had a free energy market, an open market, since the mid-90s. But in fact, when you look at, it's all still very concentrated in both the big Portuguese, now mostly Chinese company EDP, and other mostly big Spanish corporations. And the small ones have a tiny representation in this market. There's a growing number of cooperatives, but they're still very small in terms of dimension and market share. So together with this, there's issues related to corporate governance, to management, who makes the decisions, how transparent, how democratic they are, what kinds of issues and considerations go into this corporate management. I would say that, in fact, we are facing a very political issue, in a wide sense here, because necessarily there's values, there's worldviews, there's ideologies that come into place in the decisions that come into play in the decisions that are being made in these very significant transitions or even transformations that we are initiating towards a more sustainable future. There's issues of power. There's redistribution of wealth and the other benefits. So the question is really, how democratically are these decisions being made, and how democratic is the debate even beforehand. So this brings us to the issue of energy governance and the actors of the process that shape the decisions in the energy field, as well as the relations between them. And I would claim that the engagement
of... O Miguel vendeu 400.000, muito mais caro.
Alguém precisa de desligar o microfone.
Por favor, desliguem todos os sons, por favor.
Okay, so I would claim that the engagement of citizens and of civil society organizations is really quite important, in that there's actually demonstrably positive effects of their involvement in energy transitions when there are principles of transparency, clarity, openness that are respected, and then the engagement of civil society can really contribute to improving decisions, to improving public acceptance, to having an easier process of implementation of decisions, etc. However, we also know that the issues of public participation and particularly state-initiated public participation, have been mentioned. Multiple concerns have been raised about in that field and in those processes. For instance, often they are very limited in terms of time, in terms of forms of participation, and while they seem to open up some opportunities for voice and for inclusion of other perspectives in the debate, there's also closing down effects via in multiple ways, and often it's kind of a legitimation more than anything of a legitimatory process of pre-made decisions, if you will. So this brings me to the case that I wanted to talk about a little bit, which is the Energy Union project of the European Union, which is a very large and broad project with 5 key dimensions where the Union really wants to respond to these challenges of energy security, sustainability, as well as competitiveness. And for instance, there's an important highlight on or investment in research and innovation for that purpose. The interesting thing here is the fact that the EU from the outset, when they agreed this project in 2015, said very clearly that they wanted to put the unions at the core of the energy union, and envision an energy union where citizens take ownership of the energy transition. And in fact, a few years later, in 2018, there was a regulation that was agreed and approved on the governance of the union, on the governance of the energy union and climate action. And I have conducted a detailed analysis of this document, and there's interesting aspects in terms of its potential to open up the policymaking process and to enhance the democracy, transparency, etc. But at the same time, there's also other issues that should not leave us as helpful. So on the one hand, the regulations, for instance, calls for public participation quite early on, which is a very critical aspect, because often these public participation processes are more like end of pipe moments where everything has already been decided, but the union really calls for public participation to start at the draft stage of the national plans. Also, there's various policies and plans that are referred to in the regulation that are very long term, and public participation is embedded into all those different policies and moments. There's an explicit requirement of plurality in the scenarios that are put out for consultation. So not just how people or how citizens perceive one particular project, but how they view a set of alternatives. This is very important so that we don't really narrow down the possibility of narrow down the debate and the possibility of considering other multiple alternatives from the outset. And very importantly, there's also the creation of an instance for a permanent multi-level dialogue, including a number of organizations and civil society around climate change and energy issues. However, at the same time, there's, as I said, aspects that point more problematically to the reproduction of a number of tendencies in this kind of top-down public participation processes. For instance, the document is quite vague and unclear about a number of concepts, such as equal participation. There's no real definition of what the very nice ideas, but if they aren't quite well delimited and defined, that leaves room for governments to really then maneuver as it may be more convenient for them. There's also insufficient safeguards for crucial elements and conditions for public participation, such as widespread information about the occurrence of public consultation processes, access to the relevant documentation, enough time, etc., etc. So the big issue here is really implementation, and there are some signs that should leave us a little bit worried about the likelihood of all these very nice principles being brought to the ground and permanently implemented. But let's see. It's at least an interesting initiative from the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anagala. It was a very interesting conference with the citizenships and the future energy. We will continue it with Professor Andrea with the conference entitled Energy Democracy. Dr. Andrea is Associate Professor of Science and Environment Communication in the Department of Environment Studies at State University of New York College of Environment Science and Forestry. I want to welcome Dr. Benjamin Sakafal. I think there is now in our panel. Dr. Benjamin, nice to meet you. We will be the last one conferences. Okay, thank you. Dr. Amelia, you can start. You can begin. You have to activate the sound.
Sorry about that. Thank you for the reminder. And hopefully this works.
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yes. You can see it.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me. So in regards to the subject matter for today of the future of energy, I wanted to talk about the subject of energy democracy. And I would like to pay homage to my contributors, fellow collaborators in regards to this subject.
Yeah.
So this has not, I have not created any of this in the vacuum. Obviously, this has all been kind of co-produced with my colleagues, Dr. Danielle Endres from the University of Utah and Tyler Peterson at the University of Texas, El Paso. And additional contributors to this include Leah Sprain, Stephanie Gomez, and Nicholas Hernandez. And to date, we've been engaged in a couple of different activities, including an Energy Democracy Symposium back in 2017, which really kicked this off for our research group. We also have a research topic in Frontiers in Communication on energy democracy, and our most recent product is the Rutledge Handbook of Energy Democracy, of which Dr. Carvello's work is also featured. So please check that out. It is due out this year. And we are just in the final stages of picking a book cover, which is very thrilling at this point. So when it comes to the challenge that we're dealing with, in regards to energy systems, I think Endres et al. Said it quite succinctly. He said that energy transition is undoubtedly one of human society's most acute global social technical problems in the midst of a climate crisis and its ongoing disproportionate impacts on marginalized, unrepresented, and under-resourced communities. There's an urgent need to incorporate the tenets of democracy, including justice, equality, and participation into the crucial decisions people make about energy in the next several years. And this is an excerpt from our handbook. And so in regards to energy democracy, this started as a social movement, and social scientists and humanities scholars quickly picked up the effort to follow this social movement, as well as to contribute, to have a great piece that they released in 2020 that's kind of following the progression of our research agenda associated with energy democracy, talked about how this is about renewable resources and really focused on politicalization of energy governance and climate policy. My own research group has talked about this in regards to an emergent social movement that reimagines energy consumers as prosumers who are involved in decisions at every stage from production to consumption versus focusing just on our consumptive practices. And that this movement is really born out of this valuing of local autonomy over energy resources and operations and real engagement in the decision-making processes, as Dr. Carvalho was indicating. And it's really a resistance of environmental injustices, as well as trying to promote just transitions. So again, there was, before we had our Energy Democracy Symposium in 2017, there was an Energy Democracy workshop in Amsterdam in about a year and a half prior in 2016. And one of the outcomes from this was this statement: from energy access to climate justice, and from anti-privatization to workers' rights, people across the world are taking back power over the energy sector, kicking back against the rule of the market, and reimagining how energy might be produced, distributed, and used. For many, but not all, movements involved in struggles around energy, the concept of energy democracy is providing increasingly useful as a means of bringing together disparate but clearly linked causes under a shared discourse and possibly something of a common agenda. So that's the start of the movement. And so we were really wanting to know, how can scholars contribute? What is energy democracy and how can we contribute? And so back in July of 2017, we had an Energy Democracy Symposium in Salt Lake City, Utah. Unfortunately, due to the nature of our funding for this, it was limited to a North American event only, even though a lot of action was already, of course, happening in Europe around this subject. But organizers included Danielle, Leah, myself, and Charla Peterson. So we were really looking at, we were using Bruno Latour's idea of composition to really get at the puzzle that is energy democracy. And I took this picture years back. It's on the campus of, I believe it was University of Vermont in the northeastern United States. And I just thought it was a great sculpture and kind of got at how democracy is a puzzle and how it's kind of messy. You can see the Y kind of hanging off the image or off the word. But thinking about it as a composition was a beautiful way of kind of getting at energy democracy. So Latour says that things have to be put together while retaining their heterogeneity, and that this is an alternative to critique and deconstruction, where putting together these parts can help us build alternatives and solutions. And so that's really what we're kind of wanting to do with energy democracy. So when we're thinking about energy democracy as a composition, it's focused on these seemingly disparate things of energy and democracy. And we're really wanting to focus our attention on research that goes beyond just identifying what's wrong and contributing to solutions. So really kind of thinking about this as more of a transdisciplinary effort where we're working with people that are promoting this and also contributing to these actions. So when we're thinking about energy and the energy democracy composition, we're really thinking about power as it is used in infrastructures, in human-built environments. And what I want you to really focus on in this paragraph is that it's including energy resources, their extractions, so energy production, as well as energy consumption, so energy transmission in there as well. So this is kind of what we're thinking about in regards to energy systems, but also something that Sovakul and Dorkin and Ben, you can talk about this yourself, in that energy is also a socio-technical system. So we're not just thinking about the technology or the hardware, but we're thinking about other elements of the fuel cycle. And that is an image of a coal-fired power plant that I took in northwestern New Mexico in the American Southwest at night. And so the other component of this composition is democracy. And so democracy, we have to think about it as both a process as well as a set of ideals. So, and it can be dependent upon or look different when we're thinking about different technologies, different contexts, as well as different participants, different players in this issue. So some of the elements that I wanted to kind of pull out of this is that it's a method of group decision-making that's characterized by both equality as well as participation. And we can think about this in regards to direct participation, but also representative participation in democratic processes. And we really wanted to kind of pull from Chantal Mouffe's work and thinking about decision-making as a confluence of dialogue and rhetoric, where there's persuasive messages as well as intersubjective meaning making in the form of dialogue. And another element of her theory that we have really kind of relied upon is this idea of the democratic paradox, and that we're interested in moving away from antagonism to agonism, where you are engaging with people that think differently from you, have different value systems, but you're still able to come to the table in the effort of, short-term brief consensus in regards to, in this case, energy systems, making those decisions together. Continuing on with the democracy portion of this, really focusing in on values and ideals, in regards to participation and equality. But we also want to acknowledge democracy really is not easy. This requires a lot of engagement. There's different power dynamics at play, different forms of leadership that are really kind of impacting these processes. So we got to think about this as not being affiliated to a particular political party, government, or nation state. And that we also have to think about democracy at a variety of scales, going from the local to the global in regards to energy systems decision making. So there's been a lot of different frameworks proposed about energy democracy, and I've just kind of pulled out a few of them, and we'll talk further about my own. And by the way, this is a picture of a climate change rally in Syracuse, New York, where I live. One of my graduate students helped coordinate this, and so you see on the back of that bike it says, "Don't frack my water." And I'm sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but I also took this picture on the back of a bicycle, so a little bit difficult to get a good image. But some of the frameworks that we talked that I wanted to nod to is Kunzenbecker's framework, talking about energy democracy, or ED, as democratization, property, surplus value, production, and ecology. The Climate Justice Alliance talked about 10 different principles involved in energy democracy, such as energy as a commons, just transitions, energy use, and the list goes on. In North America, some of the contributions come from Burke and Stevens, where they talk about policy, instruments, and goal attainment. Continuing on, Hess approaches this from a multi-coalition perspective. Suslesky talks about popular sovereignty, participatory governance, civic ownership, and cannot say that word at 6 a.m, authorization with relevant indicators. Soren's work is really kind of focused on the political portions of this and thinking about discourses of energy security and sovereignty, and dealing with polarization and post-truth. And Suslesky and Overland, again, I point to this piece because they really talk about how it's really difficult to develop a framework that covers all different types of energy democracies, because that's really what we're dealing with. And talks instead about ideal typical understandings that include process, outcome of decarbonization, and normative goals. And so one of the things that my group, my team, has been working on for a handful of years now, starting back in 2017, is this idea, energy democracy framework that involves justice, participation, and power. And recently we've tacked on technology, because we can't forget about the technology. But there's also the embedded concepts of ecology, economics, and politics. And so this is an image from the symposium that we held back in 2017. And so when we're thinking about justice, I'll try to go through this somewhat quickly. We're really kind of bringing together climate justice, energy justice, and just transitions, thinking about inequality and marginalization, which involves access to affordable energy, impacts of energy systems, and access to energy decision making. And one of the things that I really want to pull from this slide is that a statement from Climate Justice Alliance, where transition is inevitable, but justice is not. We have to work towards that element. It's not a given. When thinking about participation, this is really, it's not just formal participation in decision-making processes, but it's also thinking of actions outside, such as climate rallies and other ways of contributing to decision-making. So thinking about it in system and out of system in regards to participation, and trying to avoid falling into these more technocratic norms of using public comment periods or public hearings that are more of this decide, announce, defend format. When we're thinking about power, don't think about power generation, but thinking about people power, our ability to influence. So this is our ability to act or not to elicit change. And again, pulling from Moof and Burke and Stevens, and thinking about this as shifting powers. And then the technology, we can't think about this without making a nod to technical and infrastructural components of energy transitions and what this means within a social context. So again, another key portion of this. And we argue again that economics, politics, and as well as ecology is represented in these different systems that are embedded and are part of this dialogue. So some values and opportunities, and I'm close to wrapping up here. As Suzlewski and Overland said, it's not easy to develop a framework, and that energy democracy doesn't really have a set definition that we're working with. And acknowledge that there's multiple forms of energy democracy that are in the landscape. And so from this framework, there's a lot of value in kind of bringing context forward, and not letting it be dominated by discourses of economics and politics, but seeing them instead through the lens of justice, participation, and power. It ties to and makes these ties explicit. And one of the spaces that we kind of see for opportunity is, trying to test this framework in a variety of contexts and scales. And for energy democracy overall, there's been a lot of effort that is contributed to this area of scholarship over the years, but some places that we've acknowledged as spaces for growth are, greater transdisciplinary networks, more empirical examples, especially from the global south. A lot of this content is coming from the global north, and we need to think about how this is occurring in developing nations. And that's, being critical to acknowledge that even renewable resources are not necessarily going to be implemented democratically, and that's something that requires effort. It's not a given, it's something that we have to work towards. And more analysis in regards to the tensions of scale and implementation in energy systems. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for inviting me. I believe you're muted.
Good. Good. Sorry. Dit microfoon liggen.
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Dr. Andrea. It was very interesting conference about energy transition, energy democracies, and how scholarships can contribute to the energy democracy. We will continue with Dr. Amela Janovic with the conference entitled The Future Energy and Transition Sector. Dr. Amelia is a senior researcher and a lecturer in the Institute of Energy Systems and Electric Drivers at Vienna University of Technology. Dr. Amelia.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here with you, and in my presentation I will focus on the energy use in the transport sector. So in this presentation I will start with a brief introduction, then I will briefly discuss the policy framework in the EU which is related to the transport sector. I will discuss the recent developments and challenges that we have in the transport sector, focusing on biofuels and electric vehicles. And finally, I will close my presentation with the major conclusions. For the long time of history, our transport was based on non-commercial renewable energy sources. It was used horsepower, wind for sailing ships, and the total demand for mobility was relatively low. With the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, with the new inventions such as steam machines, steam railways, electricity combustion engine, we have moved from renewable energy toward commercial energy, coal, gas, oil, and in the same time, demand for mobility has skyrocketed. So nowadays, it's very good that we have different transport modes, that we have very fast move from one point to another, but this very fast development over the last century has caused different problems, such as congestions, local air pollution, global greenhouse gas emissions, high noise level in urban areas. And this is something what is not sustainable. This has to be changed, and we need to find a way to reduce total demand for mobility, as well as to increase use of renewable energy in the transport sector. For example, in this figure, you can see development of greenhouse gas emissions by different sectors in the EU. And since 1990s, we can notice that in almost all sectors, we have stable, even decreasing emissions. Only exception is the transport sector. You can see here that the transport sector, we have almost continuously growing emissions, and this is something would have to be changed. The largest amount of these emissions in the transport sector are caused by road transport, especially by passenger cars. So it's important to find effective policies and measures which can be applied on car passenger transport, which can help us to reduce energy consumption, mitigate global warming, as well as improve local air quality. In Europe, we already have a very broad portfolio of policies which are implemented, as well as we have targets for the future. For example, we have standards for the CO2 emissions from the new passenger cars, and in these years we should have in average 95 grams CO2 per kilometer driven from new passenger cars. And also we have more ambitious target for 2025 and 2030. Then we have energy and climate packages for 2020 and 2030. In the scope of these packages, the goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase the share of renewable energy in electricity generation, increase energy efficiency, as well as to increase the share of renewable energy in transport sector. So in 2020, it should be 10%, and in 2030, 40% of energy use in transport sector should be renewable energy. Moreover, we have a transport white paper, and according to this document, goal is to have further emissions, but also goal is to remove internal combustion engine vehicles that we're currently using from urban areas. And we can replace conventional cars with walking, cycling, public transport, but to some extent, we will also need cars. And this is a good opportunity for so-called zero-emission vehicles. So basically, our transport sector is nowadays almost completely based on oil products, mostly gasoline and diesel. It's a least diversified sector. And in Europe, we have huge energy import dependency. So we need some alternative solutions. And alternatives that we currently have are biofuels and electric vehicles. Biofuels are fuels, liquid or gaseous fuels, produced from biomass. For biofuels production, we can use different kind of feedstock, but what we are using nowadays is a mostly feedstock, agricultural feedstock, such as corn, wheat, sugarcane, sugar beet, rapeseed. Actually, feedstock that we also need for food and feed production. So with this current generation of biofuels, we have competition between food and fuel. However, over the last years, biofuels have been also with different kind of policy measures supported. So you can see here that we have continuously increasing biofuel production since about 2000, and the largest amount of biofuels is produced in America, Europe, and Asia. However, in different regions, we are using different feedstocks. Which feedstocks will be used is also dependent on the climate conditions as well as land availability. But for all this feedstock that we are currently using, we need arable land, and the amount of arable land worldwide is very limited. In this figure, you can see the total land area, and actually only these yellow parts here are arable land. This arable land we need for food production, feed production, as well as for biofuels. And this is limited, so potentials for biofuels generation, production, bioethanol, biodiesel are very limited. So biofuels cannot solve all the problems that we have in the transport sector. So other alternatives that we currently have are electric vehicles. When we are talking about electric vehicles, it's important to recognize that we have different types of electric vehicles with different level of electrification. For the future of special interest are battery electric vehicles and fuel cells vehicles with very high level of electrification. However, fuel cells vehicles are very expensive and we need infrastructure for such a transport system. So currently major focus is put on rechargeable electric vehicle which can be charged directly with electricity. So in this figure, you can see development of rechargeable electric vehicles. And as you can see here, since 2010, we have continuously increasing number of electric vehicles worldwide. In 2019, the total electric vehicle stock was about 7.2 million, and the largest amount of these vehicles were in China, Europe, and United States. It's important to recognize that electric vehicles, as every kind of technology that we have some advantages and disadvantages. The major advantages of electric vehicles is high energy efficiency. Then they can help us to increase energy supply security. They can help us to reduce air pollution as well as global greenhouse gas emissions in combination with electricity produced from renewable energy sources. And they can also help us to reduce noise level in urban areas. But there are also some disadvantages, for example, high cost, then limited driving range, longer charging time, as well as limited charging infrastructure. So here you can see, for example, cost of electric vehicles in comparison to conventional cars. In comparison to conventional cars, you can see that the cost of so-called zero-emission vehicles are much higher, especially high cost of fuel cells vehicles. And this have to be changed in the future. But this cost reduction is already happening. For example, here you can see the price difference between fuel cells vehicles, battery electric vehicles, and conventional cars in 2010. And the difference was huge. Nowadays, we are already here. So this difference is becoming smaller. And in the future, through technological learning as well as mass production, this technology, the price of this technology will be much closer and they will be much more competitive. However, in the meantime, it's important to close this gap that we have between electric vehicles and conventional cars. And to do this, many governments have provided different